Welcome back to the Jumpify Labs Podcast, the show for founders who want growth without the guesswork. Here we talk about AI and the systems driving predictable growth. And today we're joined by someone who understands the job search at a level that most people will never see. With 15 years in corporate recruiting, David Penny now coaches mid-career and executive professionals on how to run a job search like a high-performing system, one that creates traction without burnout, all while you're still working full-time. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jay. So excited to be here.
The pleasure's all mine, brother. Let's kick things off. You've spent 15 years in corporate recruiting. What did you learn on the inside that most job seekers simply don't know?
Yeah, I mean, 15 years corporate recruiting is certainly the other side of the job market. That's for sure. And so I had the opportunity multiple times over on coaching hiring managers on what to look for, to training multiple recruiters on how to filter through resumes and what to look for in those capacities. And so a lot of it for most folks is your application to interview ratio. How are you standing out from a fairly crowded market right now and getting your experience noticed?
Yeah, and what patterns are you seeing from high earning candidates who stand out immediately?
Yeah, I mean, the standout piece comes back to some of the basics. I mean, the market certainly has changed, call it post 2020, of rifts to layoffs to what previously would have been job hopping. If you've got some pretty serious tenure and progression, those are still key pieces that folks are looking for. But even if you've gone through some of those more challenges as of late or over the last few years, there's always more of the story to be told. And so that's why it's even more important, especially on what you do after you apply, is how you're going to be standing out in the market.
Okay, so what are some of those tactical things that people should be doing once the application's been sent?
Yeah. So the biggest piece I would say is identifying what I would describe as decision makers. It could be a potential hiring manager, it could be a leader of a department, or it could be your talent acquisition recruiting folks. Because right now, if you're seeing 100, 200, 500 applications on a single post, which is more common than not right now, the reality is a lot of companies aren't going through all the applications. So you might be the most qualified or have the best resume in the stack. What you do after you apply is how you're going to make those changes and gain that traction.
Yeah, and then as far as identifying the decision makers, a lot of resources out there, LinkedIn being a big one of those for sure. And then it's just a simple outreach message saying, hey, I applied, looking forward to getting back. Don't give the full sauce. This is your bread and butter. But is that along the lines of the process?
Yeah. I mean, from a full sauce standpoint, anyone can do this. It just takes time. And that's especially when you're in that situation of being gainfully employed and still looking for a new opportunity. And look, I've been there. I've been on both sides of it where it's gainfully employed and looking feels like another project on top of what you're doing, or you're out of work and there's more of a sense of urgency that goes along to it. To your point, LinkedIn is going to be the key piece to identify who those decision makers are. And LinkedIn can be great for some of this, but it can also feel like another black hole of, all right, I'm going to find somebody, I'm going to send a message. And if they're not checking their LinkedIn on any type of regular basis, it's probably not going to go anywhere. I'm not saying don't do it because that should really be your starting point. But one of the key pieces is getting out of LinkedIn, looking to find work email addresses is a big piece, or go old school, drop a letter. It doesn't have to be all tech forward all the time. Yeah, you'll have a slight delay in when that's getting reviewed, but anything that's slightly different in how you're standing out is the goal here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even snail mail. Everyone's quick to delete messages in their inbox, but we all open up our junk mail. So that's absolutely an outstanding strategy to be deploying. And David, you distinguish between a job search coach versus a career coach. How do you typically explain that difference?
Yeah. So I think most of us see a career coach as something that's fairly broad. It can be something that's more specific on where you're at in your career, staying within your same organization and just enhancing some of those skill sets. And in a job search coaching capacity, there's certainly overlap. Some of it comes down to the what I'll call the emotional roller coaster of the job search. Other aspects is just being much more specific and intentional when you're in a job search of how are you gaining the most ROI on your time to the administrative process of the application to what you're doing afterwards. Or if you find yourself in the, hey, I'm getting interviews, but I'm not being selected as the final candidate, what does that feedback look like? Because it's very rare that you're going to get direct feedback from a company. And so being able to have that self reflective aspect or working with me more one on one in that coaching capacity so that you have the awareness of how your answers are coming across or how they're perceived as coming across, which may be even more.
And what's a recent client win that represents the results that you're known for?
Yeah. So, probably the biggest one recently is 2 weeks ago. I had two clients in the same week that received and accepted new offers because it's great to understand the process and how to stand out. But at the end of the day, getting offers, accepting offers, having options is what we're all about. And so that's the piece of when we think about it from a chronological process standpoint. Anyone that I work with is going to have a different starting point, whether they're just starting in their search or they're 6 months in and still not necessarily getting the traction they're looking for. In these two examples, it was kind of a hybrid of both, one that had just recently started in their search and one that had been in it for a while. But whether we're talking about a product operations lead in fintech or a VP merchandising in retail, the process is going to be pretty similar. Who you're connecting with, how you're connecting, and how you're standing out all goes hand in hand, no matter kind of what industry we're talking.
And this is what you've been doing for the past 15 years, at least in this space of hiring, helping people to find gainful employment. What is something that you do extremely well that most job seekers would not even think about?
So, in terms of the partnership that I have with any of my clients, because it's absolutely that. I would say from what I provide is partly the buying back their time, but I'd say the highlight to it is going to be more of the interview coaching. And that's where if you need an idea just to practice on your own, set up your phone, put it on video mode. Who better than yourself to be giving you feedback on would I hire this person? And so nothing should ever be scripted. But like when I think about it in terms of your elevator pitch, that's probably the one that you need to have down across the board for the most part because it's expected. It's expected that you're going to get the question of tell me about yourself or tell me about your experience or some shape or form of what that looks like. And so that's kind of the front end and making that initial connection with whoever you're interviewing in those first 5 minutes. Because if we think about it from a psychology standpoint, we all make decisions very quickly. The tail end of that then becomes what are the impactful questions that you're asking the interviewer at the end? That's what you're going to leave the interview. What's that note going to be? Anything that you can research, you already should have done and include that with your questions, but show your experience rather than just telling. And that's kind of the, whether we're saying the CAR method, the STAR method, all the different practice pieces that can go out there. But the questions you're asking at the end can absolutely be as impactful as the answers you're providing throughout any interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a part that's completely open ended as far as an interview process goes. How are you going to make that impression? And it's just going to show how much research have you done? How much do you actually care? How are you thinking about when you're actually in the position? What problems are you looking to solve? All of that. You also
Exactly.
have this part that a lot of people will maybe overlook, which is the negotiation part. What's one lever that people are overlooking that increases compensation?
Yeah. So I'd say comp negotiation starts well before you get an offer. And so I'll say in an ideal situation where you have your HR screening call that may be 15 minutes, you're probably going to get a question of what are your compensation expectations? What I would really encourage is not providing a specific number. And the reason is the second you provide a specific number, it anchors you to that number throughout your process, whether that number's high, low, even if it's spot on to the band or the range that they're looking at. And so even from day one, it's asking or trying to get a better sense of whether it's a position that's posted that has a range and asking more about how do they determine where somebody would fall within that range. You're not trying to negotiate from day one. You're just trying to gather information because if you're in the right ballpark, That's all you're really going for in that initial capacity. When you actually get to then an offer being received and in the actual negotiation piece, you can then use that information essentially against the company to some extent. Because if they've described, all right, somebody that's at 10 plus years or has these specific technical skill sets, and they come in at an offer that's on the lower end, you can then use that as part of your discussion piece around negotiation, at least when we're thinking about it from a base salary standpoint.
Very good. Yes, super valuable insight there. Let's pivot a little bit towards the business. You mentioned to me earlier before that you spent a lot of time on SEO, website design. When did you actually realize that wasn't moving the needle?
Fairly early on, and after hours and weeks of not necessarily seeing the traction that I was anticipating. And I think part of it comes out of being naive to some extent. And so one of the pieces after kind of getting through some of those pain points as a new business entrepreneur was going down the path of getting a business coach. And so I'd interviewed 3 or 4 business coaches back in February, March, and it was something that invaluable. I mean, it's something that I still utilize ongoing. So just to name drop, Diego Barrera, First 10 Founders Hub is the one that I ended up going with because it not only was a school or kind of class in sales, but also the building the foundation or kind of the building blocks of automating marketing. What does SEO or outreach look like at a certain point within your business and that growth? And then continuing to enhance or work on any of those aspects that go along. Because I'd say the excitement about being a business entrepreneur outside of being able to help the folks that I do is that it's a never ending problem solving capacity. So how are you continuing to reinvent in that sense, but starting off not needing to reinvent the entire wheel to begin with?
Absolutely, man. That's such a good insight there because we talk about the E Myth Revisited, that book about just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're going to be good as an entrepreneur, all the different skill sets that you need to learn, but also wanting to get someplace where you haven't been before. It's going to be a lot easier to have someone pull you, show you the right path versus trying to figure it out on your own. So you made a shift recently from producing a lot of content to the more direct outreach approach. What did that?
Yeah. So being in corporate recruiting for the 15 years we've talked about, I've lived in LinkedIn my entire career. And so it was kind of a natural pivot in that capacity. But like my largest business expense is the LinkedIn recruiter seat. And so because of the space that I operate in, it gives me the access to individuals that are gainfully employed or showing that they're presently employed at a company, but showing that they're open to new opportunities somewhat secretly or confidentially in that sense. And so it allows me to then have that direct outreach to who would be my client persona, if you will, of those individuals that are gainfully employed, but may be out there in the market in other kind of shape or form.
And LinkedIn is a great resource as well, just to have conversations. It is a platform designed for networking, and it is one that's focused on business. So anyone that's going that different route, they're really doing themselves a disservice. Where it's a platform is intentionally built for that exact reason. So what would you tell somebody who's stuck optimizing the wrong part of their business? I know business is all encapsulating of so many different things, but when somebody's super focused on one thing, they may or may not know. What would you say to that person? Maybe putting on a hat of a business coach. I know that's not you, but you have also gotten yourself someplace where it's a lot better than other people would want, a lot better than people are at currently.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest piece, and I continue to do this on a pretty regular basis, is time auditing. Talk about buying back time for my clients, but from a business standpoint, where am I spending my own time? And as I continue to refine or enhance that, if I'm spending a specific amount of time on something that's not driving the business forward, is that then something that I can offload? And there's every aspect of your business of, all right, what's your cost ratio of what that's going to look like, but how much time is that buying me back? And so that was one of the big shifts when we talk about the content creation and kind of the SEO metrics that go along to it, that still important. And I'm not saying they're not, and I know more about website design than I ever thought I would. But the continued enhancements from the business standpoint of refining who I'm reaching out to, how I'm reaching out, and in any sales component, it's not one outreach and you're done. If you've got somebody that has responded, it's a hey, thanks, but not right now. Okay, well, how am I then tracking that in my CRM system to make sure that whatever the appropriate cadence, whether it's a month or 6 months, of making sure that I'm following up with those folks? Because that's one of those big gaps that I would say that I didn't necessarily have early on. Somebody would respond saying, hey, thanks, but no thanks. And I didn't really have a way to follow up with them outside of a manual process. And so now it definitely keeps the conversation going. It doesn't mean that it's a sale right now, but that idea of future growth or future partnership client opportunities that go along to that is staying top of mind. And the other benefit to that is referrals, because referrals is how my business started without even realizing it was going to be a business in that sense. To referrals today are still a foundational piece of I think we all know somebody that's either not happy in their current position or is out of work and looking for something. And that's exactly where, I mean, some of these more structured pieces or kind of that time auditing can come back into play.
Very cool. It sounds like you've systemized some parts of your process from the automation, automating the outbound to now installing a system for generating referrals. Amazing. And David, as you look forward towards 2026 being around the corner, what's the goal for the next year?
Yeah. I mean, the goal for the next year from a client standpoint is continuing to find creative ways to stand out. Because again, as I started with, anyone can do what I coach on, but at the same time, it's one of those things you don't know what you don't know. And so having that kind of expertise of what are the best practices or what are the outside the box practices that we need to continue to be innovative on in how we're reaching out. I think it's still going to be the decision makers in some shape or form. But as we know, they're getting bombarded by messages as well, and the avalanche of applications with AI bots that are out there and just kind of the noise that goes along to it. So I think that's going to be one of the key pieces of how I continue to kind of reinvent some of those aspects of standing out. And then I would say from a business perspective, I know we're talking a lot on how SEO is kind of taking a back burner to some extent. For 2026, there's plenty of initiatives that I have on my whiteboard that are continued website enhancements or additional articles and pages that go along to it. There's also aspects of building a community. And the community piece that I think is unique in the job search space is that the only thing everyone has in common in the job search is they want to get out of the job search as quickly as possible. And so that's where it's kind of that fine line of, all right, do people really want to be talking about this in more of a group setting? Typically not, because it's kind of that all right, yeah, I might be looking, but I don't want people to know, or there's a level of frustration or embarrassment, maybe even in some capacity of what that can look like. But everyone's gone through it in some shape or form. And whether you're newly into the job search, you haven't been in a job search in years, there's a support capacity that goes along to it. So I'd say those are probably the two big initiatives of thinking through what the next, I mean, 6 months to 2026 are looking like right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then standing out, you mentioned as well, you're working on brand visibility, which of course helps you stand out. What are some plans to uplift your brand? How are you standing out? I know you said you were producing some content, but any more specifics as far as how you're planning to stand out from the sea of sameness and stand on a pillar by yourself?
Yeah. So I've done a number of podcasts like this over the last 6 months or so. I've also got an actual kind of content calendar of schedules that I'm doing that are more local job search affiliates. So I've done a couple that are more either state or federally run to some extent. And so my wife and I recently moved from New York City to Northeast Ohio. And so that's kind of part of integrating into the community, even in that sense. So whether it's more of the universities that are right around us, or tapping into more of the regional networks that go along to that. And there's some components of it usually comes down to more timing, where if a business is going through layoffs, they tend to offer some type of outplacement services. That's definitely one of those pieces that it's always a catch 22, because you don't The idea of the employer offering an outplacement services is kind of a feel good to some extent. I wouldn't say they're all like this, but they can be a little bit more cookie cutter. And so being able to be more of an individual resource for those individuals that are going through some of that, because I think the only thing constant is change itself. And so I think we can expect some of that volatility to be going on going forward.
Yeah, so good. Definitely true. All right. Well, David, you've shared a lot of your internal systems, things that you're doing, some of the things that you've overcome as far as helping yourself get to your business to where it's at currently. For someone who's currently employed but thinking about starting that search, what's the first step you'd tell them to take?
Yeah. So get specific on what you want, or as importantly, what you don't want. And so a lot of folks, when they make that decision to jump into their job search, it's all right, I got to update my resume and go. Look, resume is important. We'll throw a cover letter, your LinkedIn profile. Those are all your documents. When I think about your job search, we really try to focus on gamifying your search. Do we think any companies are playing by any set of rules? We know they're not. And so by gamifying the search, we look at then your documents as much more marketing materials. So even when we think about it from a process or legality standpoint, your resume is not a legal document. It is a marketing tool. Your application is technically a legal document, but get everything in order before you really start taking those first intentional steps of applying. Because once you start going that route, there's really not a step back. And so if you've got resume enhancements to make, of course, do that, but utilize your annual reviews. Utilize if you've got any type of brag sheet that you've been keeping every 6 to 12 months, or what are some of those big wins? Because I think a lot of folks get stuck in thinking that your resume is going to be the golden ticket, that you're qualified, it's going to stand out on its own. And the reality is, it typically is not. And so, yes, you need to have a better resume than everyone else, but putting that strategy in place of one, who you're following up with after you apply, but also, and probably even more importantly, your network. We all hear about networking all the time and how we're supposed to be doing it. And we know it in theory. We're not usually very great about it in practice, but especially when you start getting into that being active in a job search, define who's your network. And you typically are going to have what I'll call three layers. So A, B, and C. A is that family members, friends, any name that you have come across your desk, you know exactly who they are, what they're doing, and probably where they're at to some extent. Even in those networking calls, you need to be buttoned up on what you're looking for, because most people want to help. They just need to know how to help. So think about it in a way of, if somebody were contacting you as a network, what would you need to know in order to help them?
Yeah, you're sharing so much good stuff. I have to ask, because you mentioned that there's three buckets. You have your A bucket, which is the family. And yes, be clear, instead of just, hey, help me find a job, help me find a sales job in this industry. It's a lot more specific, a lot more easier for the other person on the other side to be able to help you because you have clarity. But what are the last two buckets? It's now an open loop in my mind. And
So I'll go into buckets B and C here in a second. I would say, and you kind of mentioned it, so I just wanted to bring it up on when you're having those conversations. Yeah, your goal is to get a new job, of course. But the idea in those networking calls is, all right, you know me, you know what I'm now looking for. Who else do you know? Oh, and could you make a quick introduction? Good people know good people. And so this builds into kind of those columns B and C in that capacity, where whether you're getting those warm introductions of somebody you don't necessarily know directly, but it's that friend of a friend or previous colleague, and what that looks like. Or if we're coming back to LinkedIn, go through your first degree network connections. And oh, I totally forgot so and so moved over to this company. It's been a while. And so those are kind of the extensions where we start saying, all right, it's been a couple of years. I haven't necessarily stayed in contact with somebody, but I'm going to make that initiative to be reaching out. When we start getting into column C, that's really your cold networking. And that's where a little bit different than who you're reaching out to after you apply. And it can have a little bit longer runway. And frankly, most networking can, because we're not necessarily talking about a specific posting that a company has. But especially when we think about we're halfway through December, end of years coming up, you've got budgets that are being approved on what are going to be the new positions for Q1, Q2 next year. And it's a lot of that timing and networking comes into play. So put together your top companies, dream companies that you'd like to work for, even if they don't necessarily have positions that are open. Who would it make sense to be reaching out to and seeing if have that openness to have a conversation? Because that, again, you're trying to get in front of folks to have more conversations, which will lead to having more options.
Yeah, you dropped so much, David. Thank you so much for your generosity. Where is the best place for people to reach out to you if they're looking to, if they're in this position where they are looking for the next chapter?
Yeah. So if you want to see more of a snapshot of my total experience and then what I've got going on now, LinkedIn is probably going to be the best bet. And then if you want some more of the program specific details, including pricing, package options, and what everything's included, I very much pride myself on having a little bit more transparency than most of what we get to go through in the job search. And so you can find that through my website at justlikethecoin.com.
Outstanding. All right. Well, David, thank you so much. You almost gave a little mini micro masterclass. You shared a lot of tactical things. Someone listening to this should go back and take some notes because you did drop a lot. And if you want to reach out to David, he's very generously shared his LinkedIn. His inbox is open for your DMs as well as his website, of course. And if you like more conversations like this, hear from other leaders like David pushing the envelope in business, utilizing systems to grow, because that's how inevitably we make growth and the results a predicted inevitability while sticking to the system. Tune in to Jumpify Labs for more. My name is Jay. Thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.